Hello and welcome to the Debug and Navigation tutorial. In this video, you're going to be learning about the many options and tools available to you to better understand how your systems are running, why they're running, when they're running, all that good stuff. Check out the timestamp chapters below to see exactly what we'll be covering. Comments and headers are really good ways of keeping track of your logic. So when you start building more and more complex systems, you have a sort of something to give you a clue as to how things work so you don't forget, because you can really get lost in your own work the bigger and bigger your projects become. Now, we have a pretty simple scene here. All that happens here is that a sphere is waiting for this cube to collide with it or anything to collide with it. And when something does, it goes off to this next state where it waits for whatever collided with it, exits, which sends back to here. So pretty simple, but just to show you, we have a comment action here. So I'm just gonna drag and drop this in here. And then you double click to edit. And you could say, this trigger waits for anything to enter, which sends off to the next state. Okay. And then you can come down here, put another comment in and say, this set bool value sets is touching to false. And what's cool is that you can also collapse these comments and they'll just show up like this. So if your text is pretty long, it'll get cut off a little bit. You might want to keep that open. But for shorter comments, it works out pretty nicely like that. So you could just drag and drop a comment in here, or you could right click in here and go to add comment. And besides comments, you can also right click in here and add a header. Now the difference between a header and a comment is that when I collapse this header, everything underneath it will collapse with it. So this is almost like a way of grouping your actions. So if I come in here and add in another header, let's say this one is our top section and this one is our bottom section. We can put this one after our set bool value. And if I collapse this first header, you'll see that this second one separates which actions collapsed with it. So now everything under the second header is still open unless I collapse it as well. You could say this is your second section and this is your first section, or whatever you want to call it. But for now, I'm just going to delete this header and delete this header. So this is nice for getting a good idea of what's happening within the editor. But for example, if you're examining this at runtime, you might want to be getting some information about the state of your FSM in your Unity log. So that's where we can get a debug log action. Now I'm going to put this debug log into the state where it's touching. And you know what, let's even name these states. So call this not touching and touching. Okay, and in my debug log, I'll have this text set to is touching. You could change the log level here from info to warning or error, and this will give you different symbols. If I play right now, okay, so we could see it's running here. Now if I come over to debug, open log window, you'll see that in our FSM log, we're getting the debug log is touching. What you could do as well is come over here to the send to Unity log and check that. And now if you press play and take a look at our console, now Unity is getting this debug log string is touching. So keeping debug log is a good way of monitoring what is happening within your FSMs and when. Now let's say you wanted to see what state an FSM on a game object was in, and you wanted to be able to look in your scene view and look at a certain object and have a little label here. Well, that's exactly what state labels are for. So I'm going to drag and drop this draw state label in here. You can see that all it does is says show label. It's a bool value. You could turn that on and off. And of course, you could set a variable which controls whether or not it's displaying. But for now, we're just going to have this set to true. And then what you'll want to do is come over to preferences, in general, and show state labels in game view. This will show the state labels here in your actual game view. Or you can come over to the PlayMaker GUI, down to debugging, and say draw active state labels. So we're going to check this one first. And so now with my sphere selected, you could see that the FSM is matching the state label up here in our game view. Touching, not touching, touching, not touching. And the thing is, you would need a draw state label here with your draw active state labels on. Again, you can find these things here in preferences, which says show state labels in game view. And you'll see that when I check or uncheck this, the result is the same up here. Now with this on, if my sphere did not have a draw state label action and I ran this, nothing would show up here. So I'm going to put a draw state label in both my sphere and my cube, and we're going to run this, and you'll see that they're both displaying. Some other things that you could change here are coming up to your PlayMaker GUI, and you could adjust this label scale, so I can make them bigger, or you can make them super tiny, whatever works for you. You can also filter state labels with distance, depending on where the camera is. You can have get bigger or smaller. And then you also have an option here to enable state labels in builds, because you wouldn't really want to be shipping a game with labels on it unless you were just publishing something for testing purposes. Or I don't know, maybe you would. Whatever works for you. You have this option. So another thing to take note of is that your state labels are directly tied to the colors of your states. So for example, for our sphere, in the not touching, I might right click this, set color, and change it to red. It's kind of hard to tell because that's red on red. Maybe I can zoom out so you could see that color a little bit better. There we go. And change this touching state to, let's say, purple, right? And it shows up, whatever the color of your state is, it'll also show up there in the drawn state label. So that's a whole thing too. You can also set colors for these. So if you just right click on your state and set color, you could change this to say green. And it's worth noting that you have to select the top part, the actual state body, the header of it, this darker gray part. If you right click, set color, change this to orange. Whereas down here, the transition, this lighter gray area where the actual transition name is, if you right click on that, link color, and change this to something like blue. Now when I unselect it, you can see that that's turned blue. It's always a lighter shade, so it's a subtle effect. I could change this next transition link color to, say, red. So you can have all sorts of multicolored FSMs, which could really help you read the flow of your logic. Mine looks totally ridiculous with this color scheme right now, but you'll find something that works for you. You can also come over here to preferences and come down to colors to see all of the default colors available to you. You could change their names and their values. If, for example, you wanted the default color of states to be green, now when I create a new state, it'll be green. Back here in the colors tab, you can also add more custom colors, as I've added brown here, or maybe dark blue. I can come in here, get something like this. And now I could change this to dark blue. And you can see it show up in the state labels that are being drawn on screen. You can also see the state label color down here in the inspector. And it also shows up in your log window. Some more options for debugging can be specific to actions themselves. For example, if I find a Raycast here, and if I just create a new state to pop in this Raycast. So down here in the debug section of the Raycast, it gives you options that are specific to the Raycast itself. So when it says debug color here, what it's talking about is the color of the line that will be drawn, the color of the ray from the actual Raycast. So if I turn on debug and I say we're pointing forward in the Z direction and set this as our start state, so it's actually running this logic, then I hit play, you'll see that it draws this line. And what's cool is that you can even see that as we lower our distance to something like 1, let's see, 5, you could scale it up and down. That's the actual ray from your Raycast. And this is so helpful when you're trying to figure out whether or not a ray is being shot, where it might be hitting, if it's too long or too short. Being able to see the ray itself is invaluable. Of course, if I come down here, uncheck debug, it'll turn off, turn it back on. You could change the color of it to something like blue or red, whatever you want. You'll see all those changes reflected up here. A similar one is in overlaps. So for our find overlaps, I'm gonna get rid of this Raycast. And the thing is, you'll see this little Cartesian coordinate symbol up here, which means that in our scene view, there's ways to alter the values of this action. If I come down here to debug and activate it, you could see the box from this overlaps box action appearing. And you'll even get the controls to change it. You could change the shape to sphere, and you'll see that as I change the radius for this, it's reflected in that gizmo out in the scene. So this is another way of using debug to better visualize what it is that you're working on. Same thing, you could change the color to whatever you want. The last action-specific debugging tool I'll show you can be found in the tween action. So there's a couple of them in here, but mostly what we're going to be looking at right now is this tween position. And the idea is the same anywhere else you might see these debug options. Now, when I pop in the tween position, you'll see that it automatically already gives me a visual representation of how this action is about to perform. It'll put my sphere over here. And it even gives me these move arrows to adjust that. So as I click and drag this up here, watch the values change over here. You see that as I move it closer, it's cranking up that Z value because I'm moving this forward on its Z axis. And of course, this is in the world position. So earlier when it was 0, this box is at world 0, 0, 0. If I changed it to local offset, the box starts where our sphere is. And then if I move it forward on its Z axis, you could see that it just moves however many units away from its origin point. Now, besides these actions that come with cool debug visualizations, there's also an action that's sole purpose is to give you a visualization, and that is debug draw line. So if I say add a capsule and I add an FSM to it and I put this draw debug line in it, now I can say from this object to this object, I'll say from the cube to the sphere, and I'll say make a yellow line. And when I hit play, you'll see that this debug line is drawn between the two. I can also change this, so if I just drag the capsule in here, you'll see that it's drawing a line between those two. And of course, you could change the colors. It also gives you this from position and to position, which are values for vector 3s if you didn't want to use these game objects. And then of course you can always set variables for this. So instead of just drag and dropping these in, I could set this to chosen one and to something like the chosen one. And then maybe you have like an array called chosen ones, and the type can be game object. So 3, you'll have your cube, your sphere, your capsule, right? And then let's say you have an array get random in here. You're saying getting a random one for your chosen one, and then you have another one over here that says the chosen one. So when you run it, this way you can kind of dynamically see which of your game objects are linked in a way. Another one that's just like this, that just kind of draws things by itself, is debug draw shape. So if I get rid of these, you can see that I put it on the capsule, and I'll change the color to yellow, and I'll crank up this radius. So you could make it a sphere, cube, or if you want to be able to see through it, you could have a wire sphere instead, or a wire cube. And again, you could just you could specify a variable for this. So chosen one, array get random. And so we'll see who the chosen one is with this big yellow cube. Looks like our red sphere got lucky. I'm gonna get rid of this tween action. I'm gonna pop in a Raycast again, and this time I wanna show you this hide unused option. So you can see that when I select it, this Raycast action gets a little shorter. And that's because it's removing the values which we're not currently using. You could see all these results that are set to none. If they're not in use, using this hide unused, they just completely disappear. This is a good way of keeping things tidy when you have lots of actions in a single state and you want to keep things short. So sometimes if you're looking for a value that you want to change but you can't find it, just make sure your hide unused isn't checked. So I'm moving this sphere behind the cube so we could shoot a Raycast at it. And then in this store did hit, I'm gonna have a new variable called Raycast hit. And you'll see that we return true as long as this sphere is in line with the cube, but if I move it off to the side, it returns false. So what's happening here is we're getting a readout in real time of what that variable's value is. And that's thanks to this debug checkbox down here. So if I uncheck this, we don't see that same value. We would have to come over here to variables, select our Raycast hit, and keep an eye on the value down here. It's kind of an inconvenient thing to have to come over here to the variables tab though, so that's why we have this debug option activated more often than not. But of course, using this debug option adds more information to the action, and that means it's taking up more space. So it depends on how tidy you want things versus how much information you need to use at a given point. Now, similarly, if I come over to the variables tab, instead of having this checked, and say if you wanted to have a readout of all of these and be able to quickly navigate this, you can come up to the gearbox and select debug variable values. And now all of my variables will return their current value in real time. So this Raycast hit is true. When I move it over, it's false. Some notes on navigating your objects in FSM. Up here in the top left-hand corner of your PlayMaker editor, you can see that you have sphere and FSM. That's because this FSM on the sphere, we'll just call this the sphere FSM. And now that's reflected up here. Clicking this drop-down menu will give you the game objects in your scene that currently have FSMs. Right now, it's just our cube and sphere, and I can go back between these two. And for whatever object I have selected, it'll show me that object's FSMs. On this cube, it just has the one FSM. We'll call this cube FSM. But, you would add some more down the line, something like the cube 2 and the cube 3 electric boogaloo. And now if you come over to this second drop-down menu, you'll see the FSMs reflected there as well. What's cool is that you can hop around in these, and instead of having to find the FSM you want to go to every single time, even if that means going back and forth between the sphere and the cube or whatever other game objects you have in your scene, you could use these back and forward buttons to navigate to the FSM you were last looking at. So I can go back and it takes me back to the cube, go back again, takes me to electric boogaloo, back again. And then these three little lines right here, if you click it, it'll give you the history in a drop-down menu, which is a lot easier than coming over here into your hierarchy, finding it, and then coming over here and selecting edit and going. Just don't drive yourself crazy. Just use this. It's way easier. Let's say you have a super crazy complex FSM and it's super big. You got lots of states. You got this sending off way over here and way over here. You have stuff going all over the place. And you want to stay nice and zoomed in so you could read your text and stuff, but you're also like, oh, hold on, I have to drag over here and I have to go over here. And this could just be a lot of work that you don't need to do. Instead, you have this little button up here that kind of looks like a derpy face, but actually that's just a graph with a few states in it. So if you click on it, you get your mini map right here. And your mini map is a representation of your entire FSM and all the states in it, even down to the color-coded parts. So you could just click and drag this bounding box. And you don't even have to click and drag, you could just click within it and it'll take you to that center point. You can also right-click on the toggle minimap button and it'll give you a list of all your states. So if you'd rather navigate through a list view, this is open to you. So if I select touching, it takes me to it. It even opens it up here. It makes the selection for you. Some more things you could right click on include your actions and your events and variables. So let's try some of this out. For example, in not touching, I can come over to this is touching variable, right click on it, and it'll show me everywhere it's used. So you can see it's used here, not touching, that's the state name, set bool, which is the action it's using it, and what the value is being set to. And then down here, it says in the state touching, the action set bool is using is touching. So if I click on this, it takes me to that state and it pre-selects the action that's using it. So it takes me straight to where it's being used. You could also do this from your variable section by right-clicking here, right-clicking on any of your variables. And remember, if you wanted to edit the default value of something, you can also right-click on it and select Edit Variable, which might be a little faster than, say, starting in your state view, heading over to your variables, and scrolling through a list of your variables. It's a little faster to just right-click on it and say Edit It. It'll take you right to it, it'll select it, and now you can come down here and edit its values. So the same way you can right-click on your variables, you can also right-click on your events. If I right-click on this finished event, you could say Received By, and it'll show you all of the states that it gets that from. And something to keep an eye out for is that when you're using events, sometimes they might display this little wavy symbol right here, like in this not touching state. So the reason that pops up here, and for example, not over here, is because in this state 2, yeah, it's sending off this transition, but there are no actions that are sending it. Whereas over here, this next transition is being sent off by an action. So this state gets that little broadcast symbol. So what's cool is that you can select your state, right click on that transition, and say event sent by, and it'll show you in the not touching state the trigger event action. So if I select that, it'll select the action that sends that event. You can right click on your variables for more information about them. You can right click on your events for more information about them. And you could even right click on actions for more information about them. So if I come over here to the action browser, you can see here in some of the recent actions that I've used that they have little numbers next to them. These numbers are the number of times that the action is being used. This is super useful because you could right click on the action, go to find, and it'll show you that place that it's being used. So you can see right here, it says 1. So if I go to find, it shows me the one place that this Raycast is being used. If I select it, it takes me there. This tween position, if I right click on it, find, it shows me the 2 places that it's being used, and it'll take me there. It even selects the game object that's using it. It takes you straight to the place that it's being used. And if you ever have trouble finding an action in your browser, or you just want to get to another one quickly, you can always just right click on it, and then find action in browser. And it'll come down here to the category and select it for you. So sometimes for compatibility issues, whether you're using some new asset or you're trying to figure out why something in your project isn't showing up, whereas you see it showing up in somebody else's project, you can come up here to the PlayMaker tab, Help, About PlayMaker, and this will give you your version number. But it'll also give you information about compatibility stuff like the render pipeline. It's telling you that it's being used for built-in, and its TextMesh Pro support also says it's currently enabled. So in this video, we covered a bunch of ways that you can keep track of how things are working in your scene using debug tools and other options in the PlayMaker editor. And let us know in the comments if there's any tricks that you like to use when debugging your projects. Be sure to check out our other videos to learn all the various features of PlayMaker. Links to more learning resources are in the description.